Well, under the National Emergencies Act, the president is given relatively unfettered authority to declare a national emergency. But that doesn't mean that the president can do whatever he wants at that point. He also has to identify which of the various laws that would allow him to invoke he's intending to invoke. And those laws themselves have restraints and constrictions upon them. The outset question is whether it actually qualifies as a national emergency. There is quite a large breadth of ways that the president can, of circumstances under which the president can declare a national emergency. But certainly there would be debates around whether what is happening at the border qualifies as a national emergency. The current circumstances indicate that a declaration of national emergency just to fund the border wall, which he cannot get the Congress to, and has not been able to get the Congress to approve, would be a abuse of the spirit of the National Emergencies Act. If he declares an emergency, he would be obligated to identify which of the powers he intends to use in order to assign funds to construct the border wall. At that point, there would likely be litigation challenging his ability to declare a national emergency, challenging the use of the particular laws which he identifies, and that would play out in the courts. Under the National Emergencies Act, the president is required to renew an emergency every year, or it automatically expires. That clearly is not a very large check on his ability to declare a national emergency. The Congress can override a national emergency declaration, but they would essentially need to do so through a veto-proof majority, because they would need to pass a law which would go to the president for signature to end that national emergency. Well, different laws would enable him to draw, theoretically, on different sets of funds. One statute that many people are referencing is 10 U.S.C. 2808. That would allow him to draw on funds that had been unobligated funds for military construction projects. But there are a number of provisions of that law that makes it unclear that he would be able to utilize them, those funds, for this particular project of building a wall. There's no evidence that what is occurring on the border rises to the level of national emergency. We're at historically low numbers of immigrants coming across. The president has been trying to potentially lay the groundwork, claiming that there's a drug crisis coming across the border. And to the extent that that's true, most experts say that those drugs are actually coming through border crossings, not across places where where a border wall would be built. And so we just are not in a situation where the Congress had anticipated a good faith president would declare a national emergency. And using the National Emergency Act, declaring a national emergency as an end run around Congress in these circumstances would be a clear violation of the checks and balances that our entire country is based upon. Well, one problem is that there aren't sufficient checks on the president's ability to declare a national emergency. And we think that this, whether or not the president actually declares a national emergency at this point, this episode has raised the profile of this problem, and that Congress should go back to their laws that they have passed and placed additional constraints on the ability of a president to declare a national emergency and on what powers he or she has when he or she declares a national emergency. After the 9/11 attacks, President Bush declared a national emergency that allowed him to draw on a number of statutory provisions in all sorts of ways. But again, that is also a great illustration of some of the problems with the way emergency powers are used and are allowed to be used, because that emergency, the 9/11 emergency, is still ongoing to this day. That emergency declaration has been renewed every year since George W. Bush declared it. it in order to use the powers underneath it. And arguably, that is not the way that our government should be working. Arguably, in the number of years that have passed since the 9/11 attacks, there should have been the ability to get Congress to legislate the changes that the emergency powers are, or not, that the emergency powers are working on.